Investigators spent 1992 taking wreckage apart and finding nothing wrong with it. The engines had been running and the wings were still attached. In most of that year's accidents, the crew were trained and the airplane was working. But that did not stop 1992 from becoming one of the worst years in aviation history. A beacon on the ground tells an airplane two things: which bearing out from the station it is sitting on, and how far along that bearing it has got. Put those together and there is a position. Without the bearing, the distance is only a circle drawn round the station with the airplane somewhere on it. Kathmandu had no radar in 1992. What the controller knew about where an aircraft was came from what the crew told him. On the 31st of July, Thai Airways Flight 311 left Bangkok at 10:30 in the morning for Kathmandu, with 99 passengers and 14 crew aboard an Airbus A310. 11 of the passengers were American. Tribhuvan Airport is at just under 4,400 feet in a bowl with ground rising past 20,000 feet around it. That day there was fog, with 800 meters of visibility along the runway and a ceiling of 300 feet. The instrument landing system was out of service, so the crew were given the Sierra approach, a beacon procedure flown in from the south. The captain did not like it. It took the airplane close to the higher mountains in the north and then asked him to turn back in weather he could not see through. 6 miles south of the beacon, the flaps would not extend. The final approach into Kathmandu is a steep one, and it needs full flap to fly. Without it, the landing could not be completed, so the crew asked for clearance to turn round and go to Calcutta instead. Both the company's rules and the airplane's own performance figures supported that decision. 21 seconds later, the flaps came good. The crew had run them in and put them out again, and this time they worked. The crew canceled the diversion and went back to the approach. The airplane by then was no longer in the right place to fly it. The captain asked the controller for a turn to the left. He asked 4 times. He never got a firm answer, so he announced that he was turning right instead and took the airplane up to 20,000 feet. He intended a half circle back to a fix called Romeo, south of the field, to line up and try again. The controller heard those transmissions and understood something else. He took it that the approach had been abandoned and the airplane was heading away to the south, so he cleared it down to 11,500 feet, which is a safe altitude in the country south of Kathmandu. The airplane came down to 11,500 feet. The turn did not stop at a half circle. It carried on round through very nearly a full one, and the airplane passed over the airport pointing north. Through all of this, the crew kept reporting their distance from the Kathmandu beacon. They never once said which radial they were on, and the controller never asked. Seconds before impact, the ground proximity warning began sounding. The first officer told the captain and urged him to turn the airplane round. The captain said the system was giving false readings. It struck a rock face in Langtang National Park at 11,500 feet and 300 knots, 23 miles north of the beacon. All 113 people aboard were lost. The commission set up by the government of Nepal found that the crew had unintentionally allowed the flight to go on moving in the wrong direction. They had given the distance without the radial, and the controller had never solicited it. So the aircraft's position was never transmitted at any point during the approach. Several things contributed. The fix called Romeo was drawn misleadingly on the airline's own approach chart. The flap fault was corrected, but it had already been enough to break off the approach. The radio difficulties came out of language and out of neither side ever working through what the other had misunderstood. The first officer showed no initiative and gave his captain inconclusive answers. And Thai Airways had never put its pilots through a simulator for the Kathmandu approach. Then there was the controller. He was inexperienced and his English was poor, and nobody was supervising him closely. He was also reluctant to involve himself in matters he considered to belong to the pilots, and keeping an airplane away from the ground was one of them. Gordon Kaur was 62 years old and a senior test pilot at Airbus, with more than 11,000 hours behind him. He went out to Nepal as part of the investigation and set off on foot up the mountain to reach the wreckage. The altitude took him before he got there. 6 minutes after the Airbus hit the mountain north of Kathmandu, 2,000 miles east of it, a Yak-42 began its takeoff roll at Nanjing. That airplane was 6 months old. The Saratov plant in Russia had finished it on the 2nd of January 1992, and China General Aviation had taken delivery the same month. On this afternoon, it was going to Xiamen with 116 passengers and 10 crew. The tail of a Yak-42 moves. The whole horizontal surface pivots, and before every departure, somebody has to set it to an angle that matches the weight the airplane is carrying. With it set wrong, the elevator behind it cannot lift the nose. On this airplane, the setting was where a crew puts it for landing. The crew had not prepared the flight to the airline's published procedures, and they had not run the pre-takeoff checklist. The roll down runway 06 went normally, past decision speed. The captain pulled back to rotate, and nothing happened. He rejected the takeoff and went to emergency braking. By then, there was nowhere near enough runway left to stop in. The airplane ran off the end and kept going for about a quarter of a mile. At 130 miles an hour, it dropped into a drainage ditch 22 feet deep, came up the far side, struck an embankment and stopped. Then it caught fire. There were 126 people aboard. 18 of them came out. That tail surface had taken a Yak-42 down before. In June 1982, the jack screw that moves it came apart in flight, because the threads inside had worn away and the design had never accounted for it. An Aeroflot machine went into a dive and broke up over Byelorussia, with 132 people on board. Regulators pulled every one of the type in the world out of service, and they stayed out until the fix was signed off in October 1984. That one was a part failing. This one was a setting nobody checked. Air Inter competed with the French railways. Its selling points were cheap seats and punctuality, and it paid its crews more when they flew faster. The captain that evening had 8,800 hours in his logbook and 162 of them on the Airbus A320. The first officer had 3,600 hours and 61 on type, and he had been carrying passengers in one for less than a month. The computer that paired crews at Air Inter did not look at how much time a man had on the aircraft. They did not get on. The first officer had a habit of correcting his captain and doing things before being asked, and the captain found it irritating, so the two of them talked as little as they could manage. Flight 148 left Lyon at 20 past 5 on the 20th of January 1992 for the 50-minute run to Strasbourg, with 90 passengers and 6 crew. Strasbourg has one runway, used from either end, and the instrument landing system served only the end that was not in use that night. Coming in the other way meant an approach with no vertical guidance, worked out by hand. Air Inter crews hardly ever flew one, and the captain did not want to. He decided to fly the instrument approach to the other end and circle round to land. The first officer had already set the computer up for the approach to the runway in use, and when the first officer asked why the captain had overridden it, he said the other way would add 10 minutes. It would not have. The controller had assumed the same thing as the first officer and had been rooting them for it. By the time anybody said out loud what was actually being flown, the airplane was far too high for the approach it had been cleared for. The captain's plan, the controller then said, would mean holding for departing traffic. So he gave it up and turned back out to set up the approach he had spent 20 minutes avoiding. As they came back in, the controller gave a heading and then quickly changed it. The captain took the second at once, turned early, and passed the waypoint on the left. The first officer told him twice that he was cutting inside. That left them slightly left of the approach path. The published approach runs to the right of the high ground, and to the left of it is Mont Sainte-Odile. The A320 gives its pilots two ways of coming down. In one mode, the number on the panel is a rate, in hundreds of feet per minute. In the other, it is an angle, in degrees. Changing between them takes a button press, and the button is not beside the display or the knob. The captain had been in the first mode all evening, because that is the mode for flying the headings a controller gives. He did not press the button. He wound the knob to 3.3. The panel read 33. In the mode the airplane was actually in, that meant 3,300 feet a minute. When a pilot asks for a large change in descent rate, the computer eases into it. But if the airplane happens to be climbing at that moment, it treats the request as urgent and moves much faster. As the captain wound in that number, a pocket of turbulence lifted the airplane for about half a second, so it went down at better than 3,000 feet a minute on an approach that called for 3.3 degrees. 40 seconds in, the captain remarked that they would have to watch it did not descend too far. The first officer pulled his attention back to the lateral position. There was no ground proximity warning system aboard. It went into a forested slope at 2,600 feet, about a mile left of the approach path and 10 miles short of the runway. The survivors gathered by the burning tail to keep warm in temperatures well below freezing, and they expected somebody within the hour. 1,000 people were out searching. The emergency beacon had been wrecked and was transmitting nothing, and nobody had been up on the mountain to see it happen. One of the survivors was a graduate student called Nicholas Scorius, who had come out with light injuries. He set off down the mountainside, ran into a television crew who were also looking, and walked them back up to the wreckage. That is how the authorities learned where it was, more than 4 hours after the crash. 2 of the people brought off the mountain died of their injuries. The commission concluded that with medical help sooner, 2 more might have lived. The police reached the site first and kept the investigators out until everything had been documented. The recorders stayed in the fire while that happened, and the flight data recorder did not survive it. The investigation used a maintenance device instead, fitted for engineers to read after landing, and never built to survive anything. Mixing up those 2 modes turned out to be common in training and on the line. It had happened at Air Inter before, where crews wound in a rate instead of an angle, and found out about it when they came out of the bottom of the cloud. At Mont Sainte-Odile, the mountain was above the cloud base. The Americans had required ground proximity warning systems since the 1970s, and the International Civil Aviation Body had called for them everywhere in 1979. France never brought its rules into line, partly over the false alarms the equipment gave, and partly because one American company had the market to itself. By the early 1990s, France had finally set a deadline, and it was 1992. In December 1991, the head of the French Aircraft Operations Bureau wrote to Air Inter asking why it had not started fitting them. The airline never answered the letter. Type 1 de-icing fluid is sprayed on hot and it takes the ice off straight away. Then it starts to give up. How fast depends on the temperature and on how hard the snow is falling, and in the wrong conditions it can be finished in 6 minutes. For the weather over LaGuardia on the 22nd of March 1992, the safety board later put it at about 11. Flight 405 had come up from Jacksonville and reached the gate an hour and 6 minutes late. The crew had the airplane de-iced there. Then one of the de-icing trucks broke down behind it and sat for 20 minutes, and nothing could move until somebody shifted it. By the time that was done, the fluid had gone off, so they had it sprayed a second time. The airplane left the gate at 9 at night, an hour and 40 minutes behind, with 47 passengers and 4 crew for Cleveland. One of LaGuardia's 2 runways was closed so it could be sanded. Everything was going off the other one, and Flight 405 sat in the queue for 35 minutes while light snow came down. The first officer kept switching on the lights out on the wing and looking back at it. He told the captain it looked all right to him from where he was sitting. It was not all right. Ice was forming out there the whole time. He could not have seen it. The kind of contamination that builds up in those conditions cannot be made out from a cockpit on any airliner, and the only way to know is for somebody to go and put a hand on the wing. USAir had taught its pilots that ice was dangerous. It had not taught them that they could not see it from their seats, and its crews generally believed they could. Going back for a third spraying meant losing their place in the line and quite possibly losing the flight. At 9:30, they were cleared to go. Because there might be slush on the runway, the captain set a lower decision speed than he normally would. On a Fokker F-28, that speed and the rotation speed are usually the same number, so a crew calls one and acts on the other without thinking about it. That night, they were not the same. The first officer called rotate immediately after the decision speed, the way he always did. The captain rotated. The airplane came off the runway several knots early, carrying more ice than either man knew about, and it would not climb. It floated a couple of feet above the ground. Then the left wing came down onto the runway. The Fokker dragged left onto the grass and struck a line of marker posts. It bounced, hit the antenna for the instrument landing system, and demolished a pump house, which tore the left wing off. It went over the seawall and came to rest upside down in the shallow water of Flushing Bay. 12 people were lost in the impact itself. Firefighters reached the seawall within minutes and survivors were climbing it on foot. But by the end, the count was 27 of the 51 aboard. The captain was among them, and the first officer got out. The National Transportation Safety Board named the industry and the regulator first. Neither had given flight crews procedures, requirements, or criteria that fitted a departure delay in weather that makes ice. Second, it named the crew's decision to take off without positive assurance that the wings were clear after 35 minutes in falling precipitation. 3 years earlier, another Fokker F-28 had been de-iced at the gate at Dryden in Ontario, had waited and had failed to climb away. 24 of the 69 people aboard were lost. A Canadian judge named Virgil Moshansky ran the inquiry into it and produced more than 100 recommendations, 2 of which were that Type 1 fluid should be phased out and that de-icing pads should be built beside the runways. His interim report came out in 1989, a few months after Dryden. The Air Ontario crash does not appear anywhere in the American report on Flight 405. Moshansky said years afterwards that he had sent his report to the Federal Aviation Administration and that it had probably ended up sitting on a desk somewhere and never reached the people who needed it. Those pads are standard now. An airliner leaving in weather like that gets sprayed a few hundred yards from the runway and goes, and nobody has to sit in a line for 35 minutes, wondering about a wing he cannot see. The airplane was a Boeing 737, and China Southern had taken it new from the factory 18 months earlier. An auto throttle holds a speed on its own. The crew set the number they want, and the system works the thrust levers itself, moving them forward and back on the pedestal between the 2 seats. The levers travel in plain sight, under the pilot's hands. On the 24th of November 1992, Flight 3943 left Guangzhou for Guilin at 17 minutes past 7 in the morning, with 141 people aboard. The hop across southern China is a short one. 25 miles out, coming down through 7,800 feet, they were cleared for a visual approach to runway 36 and told to descend to 7,000. The autopilot and the autothrottle were both engaged. The airplane reached 7,000 feet, and the autopilot leveled it off. Holding a speed in level flight takes more power than holding it in a descent, so the autothrottle pushed both levers forward. The right one stayed where it was. The right engine sat at idle while the left one came up. An airliner with power on one side and none on the other wants to swing toward the weaker side, and this one wanted to go right. The autopilot held the wings level by winding an aileron against it. That works up to a point, and while it is working, the airplane looks normal from the flight deck. Meanwhile, the autothrottle could still see that the speed was too low, so it pushed the left lever further forward. The gap between the two engines got wider, and the autopilot wound in more aileron to match. Nothing in the crew's actions suggests they saw any of this happening. Somebody then moved the controls back toward center. All that aileron had been the only thing holding the airplane straight, and taking it out released everything at once. The 737 rolled hard to the right. 3 minutes after the approach clearance, it went into a rock face on Mount Tianma, some 17 miles south of the runway. Nobody survived. Searchers recovered the flight recorder, and China's Civil Aviation Authority asked Boeing to send its own experts out to the wreckage. The finding was that the crew had responded wrongly to a malfunctioning autothrottle. What made the right lever stay where it was has not been set out in any published account of the accident. Copa had built its Boeing 737 fleet out of other people's airplanes. They came from Britannia Airways and Lufthansa, from Air New Zealand and Gulf Air, from Malaysian and from Thai. The airframes had been built between 1969 and 1984, and each original buyer had ordered its own instrument layout. There were 5 different instrument layouts in that one fleet. The airplane flying to Cali on the 6th of June 1992 had come from Britannia 2 months earlier and was still in its old paint. It left runway 21 left at Tocumen at 25 to 9 in the evening with 40 passengers and 7 crew. There was a storm out in the Gulf of Panama. The controller told them about it, cleared them to deviate, and mentioned that other traffic was going round the north side. They asked for a turn left, then later for one to the right, and they climbed to 25,000 feet. They never went into it. People on the ground under the crash site said afterwards that the sky was clear and full of stars, with no rain and no thunder. At 25,000 feet in the dark, there was no horizon at all. A 737 of that age has 2 attitude indicators, one in front of each pilot, each fed by its own gyro. A comparator watches the 2 of them, and if they start disagreeing, it lights a warning above both. When that happens, the crew can put both displays onto one gyro. As soon as they do, the warning light goes out, because there are no longer 2 things being compared. In Copa's simulator, the crew's trained on an airplane with a spare gyro fitted. The drill for a bad attitude indicator was to switch across to that spare. This one did not have a spare. On this airframe, the drill was to look at the small standby indicator between the 2 pilots, work out from it which of the 2 main displays was lying, and then put both of them onto the gyro that was still good. Investigators found the switch set to feed both displays from the captain's gyro. Testing showed it had most likely been moved there during the flight, which means the crew had seen something wrong. Inside the captain's gyro was a wire in the roll winding, pinched against the iron core. It had been sealed in place with epoxy when the unit was built. It shorted out on and off, and when it did, the captain's display stopped updating and held the last picture it had. The airplane was level at 25,000 feet with the autopilot in. It took up a heading of 160, rolling right to 23 degrees of bank and then coming back out, and it settled at 4 degrees right wing down. The pilot flying put in aileron to level the wings. The airplane did what he asked. His display went on showing 37 degrees of left bank. So he put in right aileron. The airplane rolled further right. The display held at 37 degrees left, and it held there for 30 seconds. Then it jumped to 117 degrees right, which is where the airplane actually was by then. It came down at 49,000 feet a minute and broke up below 10,000, doing more than 486 knots. The wreckage went into the jungle about 100 miles southeast of Panama City, and nobody survived. The cockpit voice recorder came out of it with only light damage. The tape inside was broken, and the last thing recorded on it was a flight from 9 days earlier. The airplane had been flying for 9 days with a recorder that did not work, because nobody was checking it before departure. The commission recommended that the operator put a daily test of it into the flight crew manual, ahead of the starting checklist. The standby indicator was recovered too. The damage to it showed that it had been working correctly at the moment of impact. The report gives 5 causes. The crew followed false information from an attitude indicator that was failing intermittently. There was no visible horizon at cruising level. The cross-checking between the main indicators and the standby was not enough to identify the error or to pick a reliable source. The cockpits across the company fleet were not standardized, so a crew had to work out how to set the switches according to which airplane they happened to be in, and the ground and simulator training had not covered the differences between those airplanes in enough detail. The crew did what the simulator had taught them to do. On this particular airframe, moving that switch took away the gyro that was still telling the truth. On the 21st of December 1992, Flight 495 left Amsterdam in the Netherlands for the Algarve coast of Portugal, with 327 passengers and 13 crew aboard a DC-10. It was a charter 4 days before Christmas, and nearly all of them were Dutch. It left late. One of the thrust reversers was not working and nobody fixed it, and the airplane went anyway at a few minutes before 6 in the morning. Martinair said afterwards that the reverser had nothing to do with what followed. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, they were cleared down to 7,000 feet. Faro gave them the weather on the way in. Thunderstorms, 2.5 kilometers of visibility and clouds sitting at 500 feet. The tower told them about the storm. It also told them there was water on the runway. They tried once and did not get in. Then they came round for a beacon approach to runway 11. Faro had no instrument landing system, so that was the only kind of approach on offer. It gave them no vertical guidance, and it required the crew to have the runway in sight by 400 feet or break it off and go around. On the way down, according to the Portuguese report, the airplane went through at least 2 microbursts. The same report records that firefighters at the airport saw an explosion come from the airplane 22 seconds before it landed. Somebody switched the autopilot out in the last moments and flew the rest of it by hand. It arrived at about 17 feet a second with the right wing low, on the left-hand side of runway 11. It landed on the right main gear alone. One leg is not built to take a DC-10 by itself. It fractured, and the right wing came away from the fuselage. The airplane began rolling over onto its side, slid right and off the runway, broke into 2 sections, and caught fire. The evacuation took 3.5 minutes. Firefighters were on the wreck at once, and people came out of the rear section covered in foam. The fire came back twice after that. Crews had it under control by 25 to 9 in the morning, and then another explosion started it again in the middle of the fuselage. Airport workers carried the injured across to the terminal building and handed them to the airport nurse, who did not yet know that there had been an accident. 284 people got out. 56 did not, and almost all of them had been sitting in the same stretch of the cabin. All 3 men on the flight deck survived. The Portuguese authority put the rate of descent at the top of its list, followed by the landing on one leg beyond what that leg was built to carry. Third came a crosswind past the aircraft's limits, on a runway with standing water on it. The airport had also given the crew the wrong wind information for the approach, and there was no approach lighting on that runway either. The Dutch authority put wind shear first. It found a sudden and unexpected change in wind direction and speed in the last part of the approach. That was followed by a descent rate and a sideways displacement, which together overloaded the right gear. Nothing in the forecast, it added, had given the crew any reason to expect it. In 2011, a Dutch couple paid an aviation consultancy to go back through the recorders themselves. The engineer who did the work, Harry Horlings, came back with a third answer. There had been no wind shear at Faro at all, he said, and there were 4 separate points on that approach where the crew should have broken it off and gone around. The flight data in the Dutch report from 1993 was also incomplete. The last seconds were missing. 5 years after that, a Dutch television program put a former Martinair technical controller in front of a camera. Before this flight, he said, he had signed a form postponing the replacement of one of the airplane's landing gear legs for a 3rd time. He signed it under heavy pressure from the people above him. 2 postponements were the limit. In January 2020, the district court in The Hague ruled that the Dutch state was partly responsible for the accident. 27 years had gone by. Annette Herfkens did not want to get on the airplane. It was small and it was old, and standing at the steps in Ho Chi Minh City, she felt closed in by it. Her fiancé talked her into it. Willem van der Pas had been with her for 13 years and they had spent most of the last 2 months apart. He was working for a bank in Vietnam and she was trading bonds in Madrid, and he had booked 5 days on the coast at Nha Trang as a surprise for her. The airplane was a Yakovlev Yak-40, a small 3-engine jet built in the Soviet Union in 1976. It left at 25 past 6 in the morning on the 14th of November 1992 with 25 passengers and 6 crew aboard. The flight up to Nha Trang takes just under an hour. Cyclone Forest was sitting over that part of Vietnam. A few minutes from landing, over the mountains inland from the coast, the Yak-40 descended below a safe altitude. It struck the trees along a ridge on Oka Mountain and lost a wing. It was still flying after that, and it went into the next mountain. Several people were alive afterwards. Most of them did not last long. It took 8 days for anybody to find the wreckage. Annette Herfkens was still alive when the searchers got there. She was badly injured and could not move far, and she had lived the whole time on rainwater. The first person to reach her was a Vietnamese man named Chow. The party that came up the mountain had a passenger list with them, and they held it out so she could point to her own name. They had climbed up there expecting to find nobody alive at all. She was flown to hospital in Singapore. 30 of the 31 people aboard were lost, and Van der Paz was among them. The finding on the record is controlled flight into terrain. On the 22nd of November, the day the wreckage was found, a helicopter flew down from Hanoi with rescue workers aboard. It crashed near the same mountain before that day was out. All 7 people on it were lost. Almost a year later, relatives in Britain asked for an inquiry into what had been done with the people who had been aboard. The remains had gone back to the wrong families. Nobody told Annette Herfkens about the helicopter. She went home to the Netherlands without knowing that it had happened. She found out in 2006, 14 years later, when she went back to Vietnam and traveled up to Oka. She met Cao again on that trip. She has called it one of the biggest shocks of the whole affair, learning that 2 aircraft had come down in that jungle in the same month. In 2014, she went back once more and met the widows of the men who had been on the helicopter. Flight 660 was the last leg of a long day. It had started that morning in Jakarta, stopped at Surabaya on Java, and again at Ujung Pandang on Sulawesi, and was heading east to Ambon in the Maluku Islands. That is about 1,700 miles across Indonesia. The airplane doing it had been built in England in 1959. It was a Vickers Viscount, a 4-engine turboprop, and it spent its first 11 years with Trans-Australia Airlines under the name McDowell Stewart. After that, it went out on lease around Asia, and by 1987, Mandala had bought it and renamed it Nias. By the 24th of July, 1992, it was 33 years old, and it was still carrying passengers. Mandala Airlines belonged to the Indonesian Army's Strategic Reserve Command. There were 63 passengers and 7 crew aboard for the run into Ambon. Most of the passengers were tourists heading out to the islands, along with local businessmen. 7 of the people aboard were children. It was raining hard over Ambon and the visibility was down to about 2 miles. They came in and could not find the runway, so they turned to set themselves up for another attempt. And while they were coming round, they told the tower they were turning back toward the airport. That was the last anybody heard from them. Coming down on the second approach, the Viscount struck the side of Mount Lilyboy at 2,300 feet, some 9 miles southwest of the runway threshold. Nobody survived. The finding was controlled flight into terrain. The crew had been approaching the airport at an altitude that was not enough for the ground underneath them. The record adds a possibility rather than a fact. The crew may have been misreading their instruments, or the instruments may have been wrong. Which of the two it was has never been established. When the flight did not arrive, the airport declared it missing, and search parties went out over the sea and up into the mountains southwest of the field. They were still looking a day later. The search ended when a child from a village up on that mountain found a life jacket from the airplane and carried it down to the airport. 4 of these airplanes flew into the ground with everything aboard them working normally. The engines ran, and the controls answered, and the crews were qualified to be sitting where they were sitting. None of them had a reliable picture of where the ground was. American airliners had carried a ground proximity warning system since the mid-1970s. It worked off a radio altimeter, which measures the distance straight down. On a normal approach over flat country, that is enough. Against a mountainside rising in front of the airplane, it is close to useless, because the slope only gets underneath the wing. At the moment, it is also beside it. That limitation was on the record long before any of this. When a warning of that kind goes off, the airplane is almost certainly not where the pilot believes it to be, and by then, there may not be enough room left to do anything about it. One of these airplanes had no such system fitted at all, because the country it was registered in had never brought its rules into line. Another had one, and it sounded, and the captain took it for a fault in the equipment. The system that fixed the problem arrived in 1996. It carries a map. A worldwide database of terrain and obstacles sits inside the computer, and satellite positioning tells it where the airplane actually is. It compares the two and looks forward instead of down. It can warn a crew about ground they have not reached yet, and it goes on working all the way in to the runway. The Federal Aviation Administration made it compulsory on the 29th of March 2000 and gave operators 5 years to fit it. The rule reaches down to turbine airplanes with 6 passenger seats. The studies behind it went back through the accident record and asked how many of those accidents would not have happened if the equipment had been aboard and switched on. The answer was between 95 and 100%. Before any warning system was required at all, large passenger airplanes were having about 3.5 fatal accidents of this kind every year. The first generation of equipment cut that to 2 a year. By 2006, American airspace had not recorded a single passenger fatality from one in a large jet since the newer rule came in. In 1992, the American regulator amended its own rules to require the older system on turbine airplanes with 10 or more passenger seats. It was widening the reach of a machine that could only see what was already beneath the airplane. The one that could see what was in front of it was still 4 years away.